Hello, everybody. I'm Cody Troyer.
And I'm Brent Gaisford.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review and discuss with you the best sci-fi novels of all time. This week, we are interviewing Peter Watts, author of Blindsight, Echopraxia, the Rifters trilogy, and other awesome hard science fiction works.
Yeah. Also, we got another edition of the Hugonauts book club kicking off. Jump on the Discord if you want to read and discuss Mountain in the Sea with the crew. So we'll see you there.
And then next episode, we are chatting about Permutation City by Greg Egan, because we thought we should just go as far on the hard science fiction end of things as we possibly could. So tune in to see what we think about that one.
For sure. All right, let's do this thing. All right. Welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm kind of surprised anybody's still interested.
We're very interested.
Well, we and many other people love Blindsight and Echopraxia and so much else you've written. So really excited to chat with you about them. So to kick it off, always curious, it happens sometimes with sci-fi writers, but always really curious when somebody who is an actual scientist stops being a scientist and decides to start writing books. And that's the case with you. You've got a PhD, you were working as a biologist. What made you start writing fiction?
I was writing fiction when I was 7 years old. I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was 6 years old. I can actually remember the exact moment both of those things happened. So I was just basically going back and forth throughout my entire childhood, deciding whether I was going to be a marine biologist or a science fiction writer. And I ended up getting the degrees in marine bio because, there's a lot of people out there who are successful writers who don't have a degree in creative writing. Not too many marine biologists out there who are self-taught. So that was where I went. And also it just seemed like, even when I was growing up, it was pretty obvious the world was circling the toilet bowl. And I wanted to do something substantive, or at least make some kind of a contribution to, scraping the shit off a global heel. And science seemed like the way to do that. And I have, in fact, I've done intervenor reports on conservation issues. I've worked on endangered species. I wrote a documentary, of which I am profoundly ashamed. It was very badly done. But it nonetheless managed to both win the Environment Canada Trophy for Best Film on the Environment, and at the same time be decried by another branch of the same government as being anti-Canadian propaganda. So that was kind of cool. So yeah, it was basically I was going back and forth, and at this point I was starting to run out of degrees. I hadn't published anything yet. Every time I would send something in to somebody, I'd get like answers back saying, this is really well written and it has some really interesting ideas, but boy, it's awfully depressing. Could you maybe bring in some clowns at the end? This is before clowns were
sending the clowns,
terrifying.
It does work.
Yeah, well, I tried. It doesn't. So at some point, I basically found myself working for a consortium of universities out on the west coast of Canada under UBC, where our mandate was presumably to explore the reasons for the fact that certain marine mammal populations out there had declined by 85% in the space of about a decade. And as it turns out, all the marine mammal populations that were in dire straits ate fish. And also, as it turned out, the U.S. commercial fishing industry had moved into their habitat about 4 or 5 years before the declines had begun. And that seemed like a hypothesis worth checking out, except it turned out that 90% of our funding was coming from the U.S. commercial fishing industry. And I put up with that kind of bullshit for as long as I could. I mean, I had my boss kept sort of sidling up to me at, Friday afternoon beers and buttonholing me in stairwells and saying, maybe it's not fishing. Maybe it's, it could be a sexually transmitted disease. These stellar sea lions, they're known for their loose morals. Maybe killer whales are eating them because they've eaten all the otters and now they have to. I mean, just some of these ideas were absolute bullshit. So I put up with that until my girlfriend left me because she couldn't stand the sound of my teeth grinding at night. Actually, she left me for a lot of other better reasons too. But and at that point, I had like 8 months of unemployment, and I'd had like 3 stories published in little dick-ass journals that nobody'd ever heard of. So I figured, why not now? I don't have any more degrees to get anyway. So that's when I wrote my first novel.
All right, great. So the best time to write is when you've hit rock bottom, is what I'm hearing here.
Yeah, now you're making it sound kind of like I've been converted to Christianity. It took me long enough to deprogram myself from Christianity.
Well, if it's any consolation...
Go on.
I was going to say, if it's any consolation, I was just in Vancouver for the first time, and well, not the first time, but first time for an extended stay, and I did a whale watching tour to see orcas, and they were all telling us the story about, hey, the orcas who eat the fish there's way fewer of them now. The ones who eat the mammals are doing better, but we got to get the fish populations up. Anyway, so you won in the long run. It just took a while for the word to get out. So maybe that makes you feel a little better. But anyway, okay, so back to your writing. So at the end of your books, you include write-ups of the real world science that inspired the book, along with references to papers, and there's a lot of detail there. What are some of the favorite scientific ideas of yours that you included in Blindsight? What are the things that as you were learning about them, you were like excited, like, oh, I can't wait to put this in?
Okay, in the first place, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it does, and I do have a couple of examples for you. But it's not like I always read a scientific paper and think, this is a really cool idea. We can make a story out of this, although that does sometimes happen. What generally happens is that I'll write something and I'll think, this is a really cool idea. I wonder if I can find some science to justify it. So I'll search through the literature, right? And see if I can find something. And more fundamentally, you have to remember, I come from an academic background where there's a lot of infighting, and all the grad students attend the Wednesday afternoon biology seminars, and they all put up their hands to ask questions, not because they're actually interested in the subject being discussed, but to try and poke holes in the person who is giving the presentation so that they can get noticed by senior faculty who might have funding for them or whatever. So to a large extent, when I come up with an idea that I consider batshit crazy, I like to have it's nice to be able to have a peer-reviewed paper backing it up. Because then the Brad Hanolts and the John Richardsons of the world, who like nothing better but to poke holes in what you've written, can come to me and I can say, hey, don't talk to me. This appeared in Nature. That journal you've been trying to get published in for the past 10 years and have failed miserably. And of course, the assumption here is that those kind of grad students and those kind of academics would be caught dead reading my stuff anyway, which of course they wouldn't. So it's an entirely pointless exercise, but not always. And one of the coolest ideas I think I came up with is I was reading a book. All these neuro books are like way out of date now because I was reading them back in the 90s, but something called The Cerebral Symphony from a guy called William Calvin, I think. Anyhow, that was my my introduction to Mexican hat arrays and specific primitive receptors in the visual cortex. There are certain cells in your visual cortex that will respond only to horizontal lines or only to vertical lines. There is a part of your brain that instantaneously processes numbers up to 4. So you don't have to count. When you see 3 or 4 marbles on a table, you instantly know that there's 3 or 4 marbles on that table. If there's 5 or 6 or 7, that circuit's kind of overloads and you have to go back into a manual counting mode. They think this is one of the reasons that savants, numerical savants, have this ability to sort of instantly visualize how many jelly beans there are in a jar or how many paper clips have been thrown on the floor. For some reason, they have cognitive wiring that allows them to take this thing that works for us baselines up to like 4, And they've got something that allows them to just look at it, see it without counting, up to thousands. So this is what, like, the idea of parts of the visual array that only respond to certain primitive shapes or orientations was what informed the crucifix glitch. The idea that vampires, there could be an actual circuit that, when cross-wired, provokes some kind of a response to intersecting right angles.
That's interesting. I really I appreciate the background on that. That makes a lot of sense. And it sparks another question, which is the thing that we hear the most about Blindsight. For people who want to be haters, there's always haters out there, as you clearly know.
Oh, yeah.
Why are there vampires at all? What made you want to include the vampires? Now, was it the fact that Twilight had just come out and they were very popular? This is my favorite funny theory that I've heard thrown out there.
Yeah, right. I as you can tell from my writing, as anyone can tell who's read any of my stuff, I am explicitly whoring myself to the Twilight demographic. There is nothing in my writing that does not try to appeal to the sparkly vampire tweeny girl readership. No, I mean, the characters in Blindsight were generally designed. This is kind of, I guess, a problem with hard science fiction in general, and I'll cop to it myself. We're not very good at developing believable, plausible, depthy characters because we're really interested in the ideas, right? And I can, there have been people who have praised my character development, but whenever they've praised my character development, it's universally been because I've just taken somebody that I actually know in real life and described them, as opposed to inventing a character from whole cloth. Sometimes they appreciate it. More often, I guess most of the time they appreciate it. They all die horrible, painful deaths in my novels, but the characters were configured to illustrate different aspects of the ideas that I was exploring about the nature and functional utility of consciousness. So you have your character who has a multiple personality. You have your character who's wired into various drones, various equipments. What I was missing was the kind of consciousness you have when you're asleep, when you're dreaming. You are conscious when you are dreaming, but it's a weird kind of consciousness. It's a kind of consciousness that kind of sits back and watches the body go through various motions without having a whole lot of volition over it. And the reason that vampires came into it was because several years before, somehow I pissed off somebody in Edmonton. I don't know how. I was visiting. I was at some science fiction con in Edmonton, and some doofus put me on a panel about vampires. And at this point, I knew nothing about vampires. I hadn't even watched Buffy at this point. And, I was known, I was doing my Rifters trilogy, right? I was doing stuff that was hard SF and, as you say, peer-reviewed literature backing it up and covering my ass. And all of a sudden, I'm in this fucking vampire panel, and I had no idea what to say. I did not know how to contribute, but I thought, okay, just as a, just for the hell of it, let's try and take some of the classic dumbest vampire tropes, the things that make the least sense, and see if I can come up with some kind of a scientific hand-wavy explanation to justify them in biological terms. Right. And that's when that stuff with Calvin and the right angles and the visual receptor Mexican hat arrays popped into my mind. And it was like a bolt from heaven, right? It was like it just arrived in my brain fully formed, and like, I got it. I know why vampires fear crosses, and this is why. And there's these arrays in the visual cortex, and I kind of blurted this out.
Yeah, and the Twilight fans, I'm sure, just loved that.
There were about 13 seconds of crickets. And then the person next to me said, yeah, well, anyhow, I think Spike would be a better boyfriend for Buffy than Angel, because, Spike may be a bad boy, but he's more honest. But I didn't care. I mean, they never asked me back to that con again, which is just as well. But that was where I had the idea of the vampire. So I basically had a hole for a particular type of consciousness in Blindsight. And this is like years separating them, right? I wasn't even thinking of writing Blindsight back during this con. But I had a character that needed to be smarter than people, because the point I'm making is that consciousness is essentially a bottleneck. So I needed something in which consciousness existed, but it was observed from a distance and didn't really interfere with cognitive processing. And at the same time, I had this idea for a vampire, and I thought, what the hell? Let's just jam it in there. Because who's going to be expecting a vampire in a hard science fiction novel about the functional utility of consciousness? This is going to come right out of left field. No one's going to know what to make out of this, make of this. And it wasn't like, it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. It was kind of a joke to see how far I could run with it. And once I had once I had the crucifix glitch, which was kind of the cherry on top of everything else, all the other stuff followed. I could come up with all sorts of other vampire type tropes and come up with biochemical explanations for the hibernation, why they would have to go undead, predator-prey dynamics, prey population sizes versus predator population sizes, reproductive rates. I could just basically go back to first principles and start. And the more I got into it, the more it's like, yeah, vampires. What a stupid idea. What a stupid idea. Hard science fiction novel. I love this so much. I'm going to de-stupidify this thing if it's the last thing I do. And, if you think it's bullshit, well, you're right. Of course it's bullshit. It's a vampire in a hard science fiction novel. But it's also kind of fun.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes a novel interesting and unique, right? Is having ideas like that smashed upon each other.
Yeah. And in fact, Neil Blomkamp from District 9, he's doing a screenplay right now based just on my vampire biology idea. We had to hive off that part of the intellectual property from the guys who were adapting Blindsight. And
hold on. Wait, can we take one step back here? So there's two movies coming?
There's
maybe.
Well, there could be actually more. We're actually in negotiation normally I would not be able to talk about this because it was like all under an NDA, and Neil was like, oh, we don't want to tell anybody about it. And then he went on Joe Rogan and told everybody. And if, no offense, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess that this Rogan dude has a bigger fan base than you guys.
For now.
So once, yeah, for the time being. I mean, maybe, who knows, next week. Yeah. So once he sort of blurted that out, and Rogan started talking about how that was the coolest idea for vampires he'd ever heard, I was like, okay, fine, now I can talk about it. So I'm talking about it.
Great.
And there's been subsequent stuff coming down. Like there are other things that I don't really know whether I'm allowed to talk about it or not. But let's just say there is more than one ball in the air in the whole Blindsight universe thing.
That's very exciting. Well, hopefully, movies getting made is always hit or miss, but anyway, hopefully something will happen sometime soon and we can see something. All I know is they keep renewing the options and my checks keep clearing.
Well, that's lovely. That's the best you can hope for, honestly.
Yeah.
And that's really exciting. Yeah. I think that it particularly lends itself well to film or TV, just like the visual medium. And one of the questions we had for you was about there's such an unnerving feeling in Blindsight and Echopraxia. You have a very, I don't want to put you in a box on the horror, the genre, but it has that space horror, very uneasy feeling that you capture through your writing, beyond just the science and the goings on, but just like the atmosphere. Is that just a genre you love, or do you think that that comes from like the nature of talking about questioning consciousness at the level you do is just eerie? So that's how it
I'm
happened.
not. I mean, I don't know if you guys have read my earlier stuff, my Rifters
Rifters.
trilogy, which took place at the bottom of the in the Juan de Fuca Trench, which was also very kind of creepy and atmospheric, almost gothic. I mean, I had people taking hydrothermal currents and building weird, spooky wind chimes out of bones 3,000 meters from the nearest sunlight. There was some very cool stuff about that, but I don't abhor horror by any means. I don't generally, read it. It's not my favorite genre, but I don't look down on it. And I think there's some absolutely brilliant horror stuff out there. I don't write my stuff with the intent of scaring the shit out of people. That's not part of the agenda. What I go into is, this is a really cool idea. And that can easily become, that's a very creepy idea, which can easily become, that is an existentially terrifying idea.
Yeah.
But it's not like I start off trying to be existentially terrifying. I start off trying to essentially reflect, biology and the way I understand it. A lot of people consider me a misanthrope, which is, I suppose, probably true on one level, but on the other level, I regard us just as mammals with big brains and absolutely no foresight. And we behave pretty much like mammals do, right? And I think a lot of people would consider that cynical or misanthropic, because how dare you compare us to all those other mammals that aren't anything like us? But in fact, they pretty much are. So it's not like even like I have an anti-human agenda in that sense. It's just, I think I have a more grounded view of what we are. In terms of Blindsight, I wasn't even trying to come up with the creepy idea. I mean, I spent years imagining that I was going to write this book on, and I was going to come up with, a reason for consciousness. Because, Richard Dawkins, in one of his essays, had said, this is one of the great mysteries of biology is, why do we have consciousness? You can imagine a meat robot doing all the same things that we do, but with no inner experience, blah, blah, blah. And of course, I'd never, read the whole philosophical zombie thing up until that point. So it was kind of a bolt of the blue for me. And
had you read Solaris?
Oh, yeah. In fact, somebody gave me a book in Ukraine when I was in Ukraine and asked me to sign it. You, Stanislav Lem. because I mean, this is like, I was 13 years old. My dad was taking some kind of a doctorate of divinity or something down at, or some sort of master's in theological or archaeological, biblical archaeology or something down at Oregon State. So I was stuck in Corvallis, this little dick-ass university town. And I wasn't a university student. I was like 13 years old. So I would like trundle off to the library, the local library, and I would get books and I would take them home. And that's where I was introduced to John Brunner for the first time, for example. And I would, write my own little science fiction stories. And I would read other people's science fiction stories. And I had this great idea for science fiction stories. I even drew a little pencil sketch. I think one of my stepdaughters has it, or I would run away and grab it for you and show it to you. About this astronaut that crash lands on this planet where the ocean is sentient. And the ocean is sentient because like the plankton are all acting, each individual plankton is acting like a nerve cell, and they're kind of connected to one another. And so you had this giant brain encompassing planet. You can see where this is going, right? and the ocean starts to attack the astronaut, right? It sends tsunamis and stuff to try and watch because it considers him an infection, right? And I'm in the middle of writing the story, and I'm drawing, at 13 years old, I illustrate my own work because it's going to be timeless and it's going to be classic. And I bring home this thing called Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. It's like, you bastard. This was my f***ing idea. How dare you write this in 1961? So yeah, I've always had kind of a grudge about Solaris. But yeah, to answer your question, Yes, I've read it. And to answer the previous question, I forgot what that question was because you derailed me with the question about Solaris, so I don't even know where I was going before.
Well, I think you answered the previous question was just about what, why you think your work has this genuinely spooky aura.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. So I got to add that this bit about the spookiness and
Yeah.
blindsight was an act of desperation. That was me committing surrender. I thought I was going to be able to come up with some really cool idea that explained what consciousness was good for. And every time I came up with an idea, my benchmark was to say, okay, can you imagine a non-conscious intelligent system doing the same thing? And the question kept being yes. And I already had a contract for the book, and the deadline was coming down, and I was running out of possible things that consciousness could be good for. And it finally struck me that the idea that consciousness isn't good for anything is actually a hell of a punchline.
Yeah.
It's like a philosophical kick in the gut for all of us self-aggrandizing humans who think we are these spiritual beings and this is what sets us apart from the beasts of the field, blah, 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 blah. No, it's not good for anything. It's a parasite. It's a glucose-sucking parasite, and nobody asks what good the parasite does to the host. And that's probably the most profoundly nihilistic, creepy, existentially horrifying thing I came up with. And it was not something I was aiming at. It was an act of desperation. It was me throwing up my hands saying, I can't figure this out. And then, ooh, right, that's really cool. So I stumbled on it as opposed to, crafting it carefully like some kind of a precise Lovecraftian neurosurgeon.
Although you kind of did craft it precisely, right? You were taking it scientifically step by step. Would a non-conscious entity do this? Would they do this? And like you said,
yeah.
so,
When I figured out where I was going, I went back and I rewrote the whole rest of the book. Made it look like I had planned it all along.
the scientific method for fiction writing.
Well, they actually say when you're writing a scientific paper, they say that the introduction is the last thing you should write.
That makes sense.
Because you don't want to write the introduction to your scientific paper until you know actually how it ends.
And you've been writing science fiction for a while now, a long time. Sounds like at least since you were 13. So I did
six or seven.
6 or 7. Okay.
They were playing, the Disney soundtrack to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea on CBC. And I thought that was a cool idea. And I scribbled down my own version of it in purple crayon and handed it to my dad. And my dad either wasn't familiar with Jules Verne or was just too kind to tell me that I was a plagiarizing, unscrupulous opportunist.
Hey, we all start with fan fiction. It's okay.
And I thought, oh, hey, I got away with this. I can write this. So that's when I started. But
so you have a lot of runway then to answer the next question, which is you have so many predictions about where we're headed. Do you think you're seeing that happen in the world? Have your predictions as you've been a writer started to come true?
Yeah, firstly, that's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is not to predict what's going to come true. The point of the exercise is to say, supposing this were true, what are the consequences? What follows from that?
True.
But the downbeat environmental apocalypse aspect that informs pretty much all of my writing has, I think, proven in hindsight to be way too optimistic.
Okay.
Things are getting, hell, I'm postulating look at Blindsight. Blindsight has a civilization that is supporting O'Neill cylinders and colonies on Mars in 2085. Now, things are obviously turning to crap. We've still got a climate disaster. You've got massive desertification. You actually do see civilization collapse around the end of Echopraxia, and things are going to be even worse than Omniscience if I ever get off my ass and write the damn thing.
All right.
But I still showed a spacefaring civilization with really advanced technology in 2085, according to the latest data. Global societal collapse is going to happen somewhere around 2040 to 2050. We thought we were going to have until 2070 before we had complete agricultural exhaustion of all the world's, agricultural soils. Now that's been pushed down to 2050. Just things are happening. Things are getting so much worse, so much faster, that the worst case scenario is always seems to be too optimistic. So people have, to some extent, praised my unflinching dystopian look at where we're headed environmentally. But in fact, it's proven so far to be, delusionally optimistic. On the other hand, some of my prognostications about AI seem really relevant these days. The idea of the Chinese room, the idea of Rorschach talking to people without knowing what it's talking about, which also happened back with the head cheeses, the neuron cultures in Starfish, which I wrote in the late 90s. They actually have neuron cultures now. They call them dish brains. And they say that they're conscious. They say that they're sentient. Those kinds of things, like the idea of an intelligent but non-conscious thing that can talk to you but doesn't know what it's saying, that's ChatGPT. And I had that nailed like 20 years ago. So that's pretty cool. That said, though, the reason I had that shit nailed was not because I'm some great prophet. It was because I read the literature. And I just, followed the literature and jumped it ahead a couple of steps.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm particularly insightful. It's just that I have a lot of time on my hands because I'm old and I have to spend a lot of time sitting on the toilet. And what else am I going to read?
What else are you going to read than scientific journals? like the rest of us.
One kind of cool, totally off the wall prediction that I made I wrote the least science fictional story I ever wrote. What was it called? Nimbus. It is based on some brain fart that my girlfriend at the time had when I was up in Guelph. She was looking at the sort of approaching storm front. She said, "Wow, look at those clouds. They almost look alive." So I wrote this little story. It was like the second one that I ever got published in a little Canadian literary magazine. And basically the premise was that the clouds were in fact alive, that there were these bioelectric microbes in the clouds. And then when two clouds bump into each other, you have a 500 baud data dump between processing nodes. There's an extremely slow, vaporous intelligence that is actually changing the world's weather. And 10 years later, there started this Israeli team actually launched an expedition to look for bioelectric microbes in the clouds that were changing the world's weather. And I actually have this slide showing the quote from my little story and the CNN headline. And that was just a coincidence. And that's, I think, what you got to keep in mind is that once you've written enough, you've made so many bloody predictions that just through random chance, some of them have to come true. And nobody remembers all the stuff all the stuff you talked about that didn't come true. I don't even remember the stuff that I predicted that didn't come true because I'm too busy jumping up and down, punching the air with triumph because, hey, I got this thing right. And now everybody knows it. And I'm going to write a blog post emphasizing that I saw this coming 20 years ago.
Well, you do write. I mean, you write a lot of. There's a density of ideas in your work. There's a lot of science fiction writers who write. They come up with one. Clearly, they've come up with one big idea, and then they write a world around that idea, or a story around that idea. And it feels like your writing is just a huge list of many, many ideas, which is why we asked you earlier. What comes first? Like your characters, your plot, the ideas informing your story. But it is it's apparent in your writing that all of these ideas are important, and it's important to you that they all work together. So is the science of your writing the core of it, or do you think it's more about the stories that come to your mind first?
It's got to be the science fundamentally, but I guess there's an anger in what I write, because I guess I'll read about something. I'll read about some scientific discovery or some technological breakthrough. And, those future prototyper stuff, people who, write science fiction for the X Prize people, and they have their little degrees from OCAD, and they say they're using science fiction to speak truth to power, but what they're really doing is telling power what it wants to hear. They all think about, and I've done this but myself. I've been commissioned to write various things, and we can get into that if you want. But the basic goal is, here is a great piece of technology. Show how this is going to help save the world. And generally, I look at the same things. And knowing what I do about human nature, and having observed what I have observed about human nature, I mean, hell, like, it's pretty obvious that we have f***ed the planet. And even people who accept the reality of climate change and accept how serious it is aren't willing to spend as much as a latte, the price of a latte every week, to combat climate change. So I look at human nature, and I look at any new technology we come up with. And rather than thinking, how is this going to save the world? The question I start off with is, how is this going to go catastrophically wrong? How are we going to f this up even further? And that's probably why my stuff is, if you say it is, more prophetic than, a lot of other stuff, because I tend to take a fairly grim view of what we, and there are good evolutionary and biological reasons for why we behave the way we do. The way we're behaving is not evil. It's just completely natural. And I think that if we are going to save our own asses, we have to start behaving unnaturally as quickly as possible. And then just another point, just to get back to what you were saying about how, some authors build an entire novel around one idea, and I do all this heavy packing of density. You also have to remember, most authors write a lot more than I do. Like if I wrote, a novel a year, I would probably just have one idea to cram into it myself, right? But the last time I wrote a full-length novel was Echopraxia. Right. A lot of people consider Freeze Frame Revolution to be one, but technically I think it's just a novella. And it was a good little novella. I'm very proud of it, and it's got lots of ideas and stuff in it. But even that was 2018, right? It's been 5 years since then, and I haven't come out with another novel. I've written shitloads of stories, and I did a radio play, and I've done all sorts of stuff. But in terms of full-length novels, I have been accumulating ideas now for 5 years. If you want to talk about the final sequel of the Blindsight trilogy, yeah. I have been accumulating ideas since that thing came out in 2014. So I've had almost a decade to come up with no ideas. So you can be damn sure that when I do write Omniscience, it's going to have a pretty high concept per page ratio. But again, that doesn't mean that I'm some incredible genius at jamming ideas together. It just means I'm a really lazy writer who can't be bothered to write a novel more than every 10 years.
So, we were going to ask you, too, what's coming next. It sounds like Omniscience. It sounds like you've had the plan and you're just doing some other stuff right now.
Well, I mean, I wanted to do back in 2010. This is an old story. You've probably heard this a million times if you've done any background on me. But I wanted to start writing a book called Intelligent Design, and it was basically about how random chances can generate things that seem intelligent but aren't. Again, that ship has now well and truly sailed.
Yeah,
it had genetically engineered giant squid. It had sapient money. It had vengeful lobsters that were being run by remote control by high school kids. It was a pretty cool idea, and it was my shot at a near future techno thriller, which were big back then, and it was going to be set 10 years in the future, which is like 3 years ago now. So that was always the thing I wanted to write. I wanted to put some space between Echopraxia and Omniscience, just so that I could totally recharge my batteries, right?
Yeah.
The Intelligent Design is like, at least half of those ideas are not only not so cool anymore, but they're already historical artifacts. Like, they've already happened. So talk about things that I've predicted. It was probably my most prescient novel if I had ever actually gotten off my ass and written it. But now it's all happened. So yeah, it's probably Omniscience. But at the same time, I've got I love the sunflower cycle. I want to write a bunch of, I'm continuing to write new episodes of that. And that, I mean, my ultimate dream for that was that it would be a series of novels and stories that would release parallel in terms of, along with a video game, each media of telling, different aspects of the same story.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And you would fucking think that with the experience I've had in video games, right, I would be able to pitch this. And some people have tried on my behalf, but there doesn't seem to be any way for an outsider to come in and say, hey, I've got this great idea for a video game that's not the 18th iteration of the Prince of Persia franchise, right? Like everything is a tentpole now.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of games out there that have explicitly said that they have been inspired by my writing. But not too many of them have sort of come up and said, hey, we want you to, write a video game for us. I mean, there's a, the CD Projekt Red people apparently love me. There's a vampire called Sarasti in Witcher 3. There's a street named after me in Cyberpunk 2077.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
And I would, they paid me to come over and consult with them.
Yeah, but they ended up with that signed copy that says you Stanislaw Lem, so you're out.
Now that was in Ukraine. Like the borders.
The Poles found out.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think the door is still possibly open. I mean, there's all sorts of things I would love to do as well as Omniscience. I think Omniscience obviously has to get done because I finally came up with a really good ending for it. Again, based on scientific studies and stuff that I wasn't aware of back then that I have now become aware of, and that it's kind of changed my thinking on the whole consciousness, front, but it's also reinforced certain other aspects. So I finally feel like I have something new to say about that. But again, in the meantime, there's movie stuff coming out. Let me just.
It sounds like you're plenty busy.
There's that.
I'm not questioning that.
There's at least 4 like TV/movie things that I've currently done work on, and there is a possible 5th thing based on Rifters that last I heard somebody was interested in, and my agent was talking with them, but nothing's been signed yet. So I've got plenty to do in the meantime, but and I will do the stuff that keeps me alive. But yeah, my heart's with the novels.
For sure. Well, ours too. We hope you can write one soon.
If you want me to write one soon, then what you got to do is you got to sabotage all this other shit. You got to deep fake a picture of me in bed with a Saint Bernard. Make sure it's an underage Saint Bernard. Or make a fake Twitter account with my name on it and have me make some weird anti-Semitic bullshit. Kanye had it right or something. Like, get me canceled so that I don't get any of these other jobs, that I'll have nothing to do. I'll be back in the position I was when I was unemployed after quitting marine biology in a huff, and I'll have nothing to do except write a novel. Yeah. Do we have a plan?
Well,
do we have an accord?
Yeah. So yeah, we can be your frenemies on this. We can sabotage you.
Well, it was really wonderful talking to you. Thanks for spending the time with us.
It was my pleasure. What did I have to do? I got nothing to do except write novels.
Yeah, it's been so wonderful. So yeah, well, we'll sabotage your projects, and then we'll read Omniscience, and then we'll keep going from there.
That sounds really good. Or maybe you could like rehabilitate me. I could rescue a baby from a burning building or something, and then everything goes back the way it was. You hit the reset button like the old Star Trek episodes. Okay, we have a deal.
Sounds good. We have an accord. Thank you, Peter.
Go away, get to work on that.
Wonderful talking to you.
And you. It was fun. Thank you.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Bye.